When Benjamin Netanyahu visited the United States and visited Congress, I mean, you had 58 standing ovations for him, even though the International Criminal Court had a warrant out for his arrest. I mean, it's ridiculous. The situation in LA, much of what's going on is really outrageous. In other words, I'm not aware of anything like this happening before, with immigration officers, for example, stationed outside schools and going through neighborhoods and rounding people up. And, that naturally has caused a tremendous amount of concern and fear within the Latino, the Hispanic community. His name is Alex Padilla. He's the senior senator of California. He was elected from a state of 40 million people, and he was dragged to the ground and handcuffed by the Secret Service agents or whoever it was, the FBI agents who were around the cabinet official, Noam. So, I mean, we're talking about just, tremendously outrageous developments happening in American society, which naturally will cause a backlash. I mean, when we're talking about, for example, the illegal immigrants in California, they're probably something like 10% of the population. And the notion of their being treated in such a harsh manner by the government is really outrageous. Even though they're probably only 10% of the California population, maybe even less than that, I mean, they're probably most Hispanic families in California. Hispanics are about 35–40% of California's population. Probably most Hispanic families have at least one family member who falls into that category. And there's right now tremendous fear in the community. I mean, people being afraid to go to their jobs, being afraid to go outside for fear of being rounded up by the immigration authorities and deported. So, I mean, it's just a very, very extreme situation compared to anything that's happened in decades in California. In fact, probably in my lifetime. There are certainly protests, and there's been some vandalism, and a few, stores have been, vandalized and things like that. And that's why, for example, the fact that Trump has talked about bringing in the Marines, bringing in, federalizing the National Guard, and sending them into Los Angeles is just totally ridiculous. I mean, there's nothing like that. There's no sort of violence like that going on. Now, part of the reason this has sort of gotten out of hand is that in the last few years, there really been a massive wave of illegal immigration to the United States. In other words, it wasn't even illegal immigration. In other words, the political leadership of both the Democratic and the Republican parties had moved towards a sort of open borders policy. In other words, a policy of saying that anybody who wants to come to the United States should be allowed to come. And so, certainly millions of people have arrived. They've generally been given, by declaring themselves to be potential refugees, they basically have been allowed to stay in the United States without being deported. And so the numbers have really been huge. And in many cases, that's actually caused a backlash within the existing immigrant community. And so, for example, strangely enough, Donald Trump got more support among Latinos and among immigrants than any Republican had gotten probably in 40 or 50 years, partly because the immigrant community, the Latino community, was also disturbed about such a huge wave of new immigrants coming in, such large numbers of them. And so that basically motivated many of them to support Donald Trump, who promised to crack down on it. Whereas Donald Trump was sort of talking about rounding up and expelling the very recent immigrants, people who had arrived in the last 6 months or year or 2 years, or immigrants who committed crimes, who were criminals. That's what he focused on. What actually has now happened is that the roundups have targeted people who've been living perfectly respectable lives in California for 10 years, 20 years, 25 years. So in other words, the concern is people who've been living here, holding jobs, being part of the community for 20 years, being arrested by the ICE and deported again. And, that sort of thing has caused a tremendous amount of fear in the community. So if Donald Trump had merely tried to round up and deport people who had arrived in the last year or two, or immigrants who'd committed serious crimes, there would have been very little opposition to him from the community. But it's just that many of the people around him are really sort of fanatic anti-immigrant types. And they really are talking about trying to round up hundreds of thousands or millions of people and deport them all, which, is just totally impossible and irrational. So it's the sort of thing, many times what happens in a political system is extremists from both sides are the groups that basically gain, authority, and it goes back and forth between them. So, in other words, until Donald Trump came in, America really had, for a couple of years in the aftermath of the COVID epidemic, an almost open borders policy where millions of people were able to come into the United States without almost any restrictions, because that was the ideological view of some of the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party. And that's exactly what happens. And that has caused these protests to take place. And, in turn, the protests have been portrayed to Donald Trump as being a sort of uprising, a violent uprising of groups in California, which is why Donald Trump was talking about sending Marines to Los Angeles, which is totally ridiculous. Donald Trump has done so many different outrageous things since he became president. I mean, for example, with his crazy tariff policy, with so many of his other statements, that, there's certainly a huge base of people who strongly oppose him. Trump was never popular in California. In other words, Trump lost California by huge margins. So in other words, the large majority of the people in California dislike him, and that certainly is even stronger in Los Angeles. So, I mean, there are all those different contributing factors. But I do think it's the immigration roundups in Los Angeles that have really triggered the protests there. And the sign of it is, for example, the protests are in Los Angeles. They're not in the other parts of the country where Trump is, really quite unpopular for similar ways, or at least the protests began in Los Angeles. And they began in Los Angeles because of the roundups of his immigration authorities, and also because he was talking about sending the Marines and the National Guard to Los Angeles. I mean, that is unprecedented. I think the last, in California, in American law, normally the National Guard or Marines or anything like that are only sent to a city if there's massive rioting, and if they're called in by the governor or by the mayor or by the local authorities. In this case, the governor specifically said there was no need to have these forces brought in. The mayor said exactly the same thing. In other words, the mayor and the governor were opposing Donald Trump's policies. But he took the unprecedented step of federalizing the National Guard and sending them into Los Angeles. I think the last time that happened was like 60 or 70 years ago. So it's not something that, has ever happened in recent decades. And that, in turn, I think, provoked some of the protesters to become much more agitated, much more angry, and in some cases, for example, vandalizing shops, or setting a few fires or something like that, or waving flags. So in other words, it's the sort of thing, if the government cracks down in an extreme way on protests, on peaceful protests, that can sometimes cause the protesters to become more determined, more energetic, and sometimes even more violent. Though, again, these protests are very, very mild compared to what happened in Los Angeles and certainly other parts of the country 3 or 4 years ago, the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, really, so many of the actions Trump has taken have been entirely illegal. Take, for example, the tariff policy from a couple of months ago. Tariffs are taxes. Congress needs to pass taxes. All tariff policies are always passed by Congress. But Trump just said, I can do anything. So he basically implemented these tariff policies. And because, Trump is so outrageous in so many of his actions, basically nobody was willing to stand up to him on something like that. So, in other words, Trump has taken many actions on many, many different areas that clearly violate the law and the Constitution and the standard operating procedure of the United States. So, I mean, what he's doing in Los Angeles is no more outrageous than his tariff policies or so many of the other things he's done. But just that in the case of LA, because of the immigration issue and because of, the fear being raised in the immigrant community by these roundups, these seem much more of a direct reaction. For example, another thing that, had happened a couple of months ago, which was in some ways even more outrageous. Trump was basically sending his authorities, his immigration authorities, to round up college students who simply had criticized the policies of the government of Israel. I mean, it was really outrageous. For example, there was a video scene of a graduate student, a Tufts graduate student, who'd simply a year before signed an op-ed criticizing the government of Israel. And as she was walking on the streets of her Boston area town, she was rounded up, grabbed by 6 masked government officials, and hustled into an unmarked van. I mean, nothing like this has ever happened in American history before. Nothing like that. For example, when you take cases of some of the most serious spies in American history, the Rosenbergs, for example, who gave our nuclear weapons secrets to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. I mean, you can't get anything more dangerous than that. They were simply, the FBI was sent to their homes. They were arrested and taken into custody. Well, in this case, a graduate student who'd committed no crime, but had simply signed her name to an op-ed in her school newspaper, which criticized the policies of the state of Israel. She was rounded up by 6 masked government agents. And she was kept incommunicado for like 24 hours. So at first, nobody even knew what had happened to her. And, again, these masked government agents have been raiding student housing at Columbia, at other universities around the country. I mean, this is really just totally outrageous. So I think probably those sorts of actions before have probably helped, raise people's anger against Trump. What's now going on in Los Angeles, where people are being rounded up, because they're undocumented, because they're illegal immigrants. But probably, part of the backlash against Trump's policies over that has because people have heard of these other cases of masked government agents seizing people off the street and dragging them away. I mean, that's something that has never happened in American history before. And, it's just utterly outrageous. So, Trump has been sort of violating the law or violating government policy or even constitutional rights in so many different areas that it's not surprising that, some of the people angry about that might be supporting or even involved in some of these demonstrations. In other words, for example, those actions, seizing students who simply had written an op-ed in their student newspaper, that's a clear violation of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech in America. It's something that's absolutely black and white. So, there's obviously now legal steps have been taken to, bar these actions. And, basically appellate judges have issued injunctions against this sort of thing. But, until those judicial rulings came down, I mean, these actions were taking place in American society. I mean, they were videotaped. They were shown over the internet. So, I mean, that's certainly why a lot of people on all these different issues are very outraged over Donald Trump's policy. I mean, that certainly is causing a serious political rupture between California and Washington over this. I don't think that has ever happened to a U.S. senator in all of American history before. At least I've never heard of such a case. It's just unbelievable, the sort of stuff that's happening. And I mean, part of it is Trump is sort of so old and so out of touch that he's probably barely even aware of some of these things taking place. And some of the people below him are, really very sort of extreme, excitable people. So, in other words, I think they lost a lot of credibility by making all these accusations against Trump 4 or 5 years ago, when he wasn't doing any of these outrageous things. So now when he is doing all these outrageous things, many of them don't really have much to say. People voted for Donald Trump in 2016, not because they necessarily liked Donald Trump, but because they hated the political leadership of both parties so much. And that's also part of the reason that Donald Trump was reelected this time. Not because there was such tremendous support for Donald Trump, but there was so much hostility and opposition to the policies of the Biden administration. For example, if you take Biden's Middle East policies, so many Democrats were so totally outraged over Biden's support for Israel and Israel's attacks in Gaza that they refused to vote for Biden. And that's the reason that Trump got elected. And some of them possibly even voted for Donald Trump or voted for a third-party candidate or something like that. So, I mean, American society is far, far more fragile right now than it's probably been in many, many decades. And so Donald Trump just, as you were indicating, and these demonstrations are more symptoms of a much deeper problem than anything else. And I mean, the fact that Trump, for example, is ignoring so many laws in the United States. I mean, Trump is basically doing things that no American president has probably done in generations. Just willfully ignore all of these laws and government policies and basically does whatever he wants. I mean, his crazy tariff policy. I mean, the tariffs he was talking about implementing were obviously illegal. And in fact, a judge ended up ruling against them. But I mean, the American judicial system operates in a very slow manner. So Trump implemented these illegal policies, and they remained in effect for several months until Trump finally backed down and until, they were halted by a judicial ruling. And in fact, in a number of cases, judges had ruled against Trump's policies on immigration, on tariffs and other things. And Trump had said he would ignore those judicial rulings, which is something really almost unprecedented for an American president to do, simply ignore the rulings of judges on these points. Now, it's certainly true that over the generations, judges have usurped more and more political power in the United States, which really has been a very negative development. But instead of, for example, making a rational case on those grounds and arguing that judicial power should be more circumscribed, Trump simply said he would ignore what the judges said. He would simply ignore the law, which, really is very outrageous. And I mean, one of the problems is that with Trump, having so much power and so much support from a small but very determined base of supporters, I mean, some of these judges probably were reluctant to really take strong positions against Trump for fear that Trump would simply ignore them completely. I mean, in fact, the Supreme Court was, I think, somewhat concerned that Trump would simply ignore a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, Trump is basically just somebody who does whatever he wants. And, it's a huge problem for the United States and for the rest of the world as well. And Trump, I think, is the biggest symptom of the breakdown of order in American society, the fact that Trump is got elected and is doing the things he's doing. I mean, that's certainly a huge factor. I mean, the problem is most elected officials in the United States are despised by the public. I mean, sometimes they're even despised by the people who elected them. In the past, if you go back 10, 20, 30 years ago, there were large numbers of elected officials who had a tremendous amount of credibility and prestige with the American people. In other words, if they said something, people paid a great deal of attention to what they were saying. But these days, most American elected officials, and probably, in fact, the vast majority of them, are really despised by most ordinary Americans. I mean, they're despised not only by members of the opposing party, but members of their own party as well. And you have a relatively small number of elected officials who are considered relatively honest and independent and sincere. I mean, one example of that is you see all of these votes on, Middle Eastern policy in Israel, where virtually every member of Congress supports giving more money and more weapons to the state of Israel. And, for example, when Benjamin Netanyahu visited the United States and visited Congress, I mean, you had 58 standing ovations for him, even though the International Criminal Court had a warrant out for his arrest. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so the number of elected officials in the United States who have any sort of credibility is very small. And that's actually one reason Donald Trump was elected. Because even though he was hated by half of the country, he probably was greatly supported by most of the other half. Whereas most elected officials are simply despised by really almost everybody. For example, when Donald Trump was running against Kamala Harris, his opponent, Kamala Harris was very unpopular among Democrats and among Republicans. The only reason she almost got elected was she was running against Donald Trump, and she tried to persuade people that Trump would be even worse. But she herself had very little support. So, I mean, the last few elections America's had, the presidential election, have been fought between individuals, Donald Trump on one side and Democrats on the other side, where the Democrats Trump was running against were so incredibly unpopular, including among the Democratic Party itself, that Trump either won or came very close to winning in all three elections.